Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman, and today we're moving right along into the kind of further adventures of the Gilded Age. And I talked a lot about some of the robber barons and captains of industry of so forth so far a little bit, and uh, uh, some of those at the top. And so today I want to focus a little bit more on what was actually going on with the more middle or lower classes, because those are going to be where the vast majority of Americans reside. And in particular, as America is becoming a more urban nation, where people are moving away from being purely in rural areas into being into also more um, urban areas, as America is moving further into the cities. Also, immigration is going to certainly play a role, right? Because as it turns out, as immigration is becoming more and more of a thing. Now, we had always had periods of immigration, but in particular, we're going to see a boom in the late 19th, going into the early 20th century with regards to immigration. And the groups are starting to change a little bit in terms of those who are coming in larger numbers. Okay. So after the Civil War, the urban population is going to jump from roughly about 10 million in about 1870 to triple to 30 million in 1900. That is a dramatic increase, right? And 10 million is already at that point in global history already a pretty sizable amount of people, but 30 million in 1900 just shows that America's rapid industrialization over the course of that amount of time, the urban population that is, dramatically increasing over the course of that time, right? And so most of the immigrants who arrived here in the United States lacked the money to buy and develop farms. And so education was also to obtain higher paying jobs. They lacked that, which meant that oftentimes they couldn't go to more rural areas because they didn't have the experience with farming. They didn't have the kind of education to go for more higher paying jobs, even in cities. Many of them are settling in cities and taking more lower class or middle class kind of industrial jobs. Okay, often in factories that are very, far behind in terms of what people should be paying. But even so, even despite those circumstances, this is for many actually an upgrade, believe it or not, right? Many of them are leaving countries for various reasons in Europe that are going through some tough times themselves. So even despite how tough the factory life can be here in America and how they're working long hours and they're not getting paid enough, as I said, it's still an upgrade for a great many people. Immigrants, that is. And many rural Americans are also moving to the cities to try to get away, more jobs than was being offered in agrarian areas. Also, the cities certainly had many more resources at their disposal to take care of people's kind of needs, but also some of their wants, right? So, obviously, you're going to, as electricity is slowly starting to unveil itself across the American landscape, they're obviously going to have better lighting, better lit cities. In cities than as opposed to rural environments. Also, running water is starting to become more and more of a common thing. Modern plumbing, generally speaking, also as far as more desirable or things that enrich the human mind as opposed to purely the human body. You're going to have museums in larger cities. You're going to have libraries, so education is going to be a more attainable thing in some more urban environments, as well as theaters. And this is still purely mostly talking about kind of dramas and physical live theater, but also cinema is slowly starting to unveil itself to the American public as opposed to many other things in possible in cities that aren't not as possible in rural environments. So in general, rural America is going to slowly start to transition into being more suburban or if not outright urban. So again, there's certainly people that still lived in rural areas, but more and more slowly starting to make that transition into living in more urban areas. Okay. So as cities grow, naturally, the demand for space and land is skyrocketing, right? There's only so much land in a city you can do or you can develop. So many are going to start to get the bright ideas. Well, why don't we can't go so far out. We've reached our limit, but what if we start going up? So skyscrapers are going to start to be built to accommodate the fact that we only have so much land, but more people's coming here. We can't go too farther outward. So instead we'll go upwards, right? So there is an incentive to build upward as opposed to just purely outward. Chicago's Louis Sullivan. He's going to be this very prominent skyscraper designer and builder. He builds a lot of stuff in Chicago and other major cities on the East Coast, especially like, say, New York City or in Philadelphia, Boston, are paying attention to what's happening in Chicago and start to try to translate it elsewhere, right? So mass transit naturally is also going to become more and more important, right? Because cars aren't around just yet. They're in their very, very, very earliest stages. It's certainly not kind of a common consumer act of buying a car, right? So mass transit's going to really help move people around the city quickly, meaning that basically public transportation, trains, trolley cars, etc. Cable cars also pulling along, basically cars pulled along tracks by underground cables. And this naturally, these train tracks or this mass transit systems are going to be elevated that allows for, to travel in the air, so to speak, but also you're starting to build underground. And so the very first subway systems are going to be developed both in the city of Boston and in New York City. Okay. And in general, high society is going to dominate a lot of the more kind of inner city areas at this particular moment, right? Where the wealthiest families establish themselves in these very incredibly ornate and fashionable districts in the heart of the city. Okay. So many of them are looking towards Europe because Europe at this time is still considered the highest class, the best of the best. They're seeing how English manors were constructed or French chateaus, basically a fancy word for a mansion or manor, and are constructing these quite literally in the heart of the city, right? So now we kind of think some of those estates as being outside of cities, but at this particular time in the late 19th century, they're building these relatively large, ornate, well-constructed homes actually within the cities themselves, okay? And as naturally as these homes are growing larger, there is an increase in the need and the demand for servants to work in these homes. And of course, servants aren't quite slaves, right? They're better off than that, most certainly. They have more agency in so many ways. And so this is going to be a pathway to success for women. So women are going to more readily and easily find work in some of these environments, okay? And also it's going to give not only the wealthy, but even the more middle-class folks an opportunity to spend a great deal of their money more on consumerist or social activities, okay? This here just gives you a window in some of the manors that were created during this Gilded Age period. This one here in the right corner is actually the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. I've been there plenty of times. So hopefully you have too. Beautiful, beautiful manor. Again, that was built by George Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who I said was kind of that influential railroad magnate. Okay. And if you ever get the chance to go to Asheville or go to Biltmore Estate, I would highly encourage you to do so just to get an opportunity to see how that other half lived, right? How the wealthiest and the most well-to-do people of that time in society lived. Now, of course, that was not the common way that average people live, like me or you. The ultra-wealthy was able to construct estates like that. But it is an incredibly beautiful place to see if you ever get the chance to do so. Okay. So, but what's going on with the more middle class folks, right? This constitutes the vast majority of the American public. Certainly, the industrialism of this time and this period expands the middle class significantly. So you're starting to have more professionalized jobs by the middle class take root during this time. So doctors, there's an increase in the number of doctors, lawyers, engineers, managers, social workers, architects, teachers, look at me, during this time, which is great because it further expands the middle class and allows the middle class to have, again, more economic agency, more upward possibilities for upward mobility than it'd possibly be given in the past. Okay, and so many of the middle class are going to move away from cities. Cities are mostly growing, but some of the middle class are going to start to move away from cities for a variety of reasons. One, crime, pollution in the cities, which we'll talk about probably a little bit in class if I have you. And also, it's the land is cheaper in kind of more suburban or rural areas. And so you can build or afford larger homes in that sense. So a lot of these communities that are outside of the cities, but where people mostly live, but mostly live in these outside areas, but then transit themselves to work, are going to become known as streetcar suburbs. And the suburbs are going to have several periods of growth that I'll talk about. Sometime a little bit during this time, also in the 1920s, but especially significantly in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, where suburbs get even larger and larger. But these streetcar suburbs are going to start to grow in the late 19th century, where people, again, are living outside of the cities, more middle-class folks, and then driving into and coming into the cities to work or earn their living, okay? Most middle-class families could afford sometimes at least one live-in servant, and that is, again, is going to give women in the home more time to pursue activities outside of the home, right? So we're not talking about women voting just yet, but that is around the corner. And part of this, again, less work in the home for women to do allows them to socialize more, allows them to read more, allows them to start talking about more potent kind of political ideas with their fellow women. And so women's clubs are going to start to enjoy an increase in popularity during this time. And they're initially focusing more on social and educational activities, but also are going to start to transform themselves into being outright active, charitable, and reform organizations. And of course, again, a lot of that has to do in some ways with the social gospel during this time, the idea that we should be helping our fellow man, our fellow brothers and sisters, and it's particularly through usually a Christian kind of philanthropic lens. Okay, so again, women are starting to get a little bit more freedom, a little bit more mobility. They still don't have the right to vote just yet, but that is coming pretty soon. Okay. Now, what about the working class? This is maybe a step below the kind of traditional middle class. These are maybe your more lower middle class, if not lower class people. Few families in these urban working areas can ever hope to afford buying a home because the average industrial worker's income in the late 19th century was about $445 a year, right? So even if we adjusted for inflation, that number would certainly be higher, but that's still, even at that time, a pretty low amount of money. So most of this working class folk, they spend their lives living in crowded tenements, which is just another name for apartment buildings. And these apartment buildings, if you go back and look at them, are incredibly tight, incredibly condensed. And so these families are basically living on top of one another. And again, pretty hazardous way to live, and just unclean and unsafe in a variety of ways. Now, 64% of working class families typically relied on more than one wage earner, meaning that maybe the husband and wife worked, or maybe the husband and some of the kids worked. So they need everybody working in some of these working class homes to make ends meet. And so oftentimes whole families are commonly working, as I said, even especially children. Now, a lot of reformers during this time, and they're going to transition into being in the progressive movement, are going to be really worried about dangerous working conditions for children. And also that, hey, these kids should be in school, right? That these kids should be in school. They shouldn't be forced to work, because the more education that these kids are getting, the more opportunities for success they're going to have, right? So if they're not in school and they're just purely working, they're almost certainly going to be stuck in that rut their entire lives, where they're working the same way that their parents are and don't have a lot of opportunities for upward mobility, right? So that is going to be a valid concern that's being raised during these times. Okay, so women are also starting I've been talking about this for some time now, back in the first semester even. Women are starting to work a little bit more, but it's mostly only finding work in clerical jobs or maybe teaching jobs. But they're mostly working, again, not in the great conditions, right? Long hours, low wages, outright isolation. And that's not healthy for anyone, right? And this is really sad to think about. Oftentimes when a child or a woman or even a grown man are killed in maybe a workplace accident, there's absolutely nothing in the way of workers' compensation to actually aid the family during this time of need, to make the tragedy that befell their lives a little easier. Oftentimes that safety net just does not exist, which is very sad. Okay, so there's no compensation oftentimes for people being injured or killed on the job, which means that people are not being properly cared for. And as a result, people are being hurt and families are not being taken care of. So it goes without saying, you don't have to look too far to understand that the working class is going through a lot of problems and a lot of struggles in this new industrialized environment. And it goes even further when we're talking about kind of urban problems, some community problems. Crime is especially rampant and bad in some of these growing cities during this time. And it's going to really become a problem in the sense that, again, as I talked about with the West, the more people you're moving into these small areas or small environments, the greater the chance of people being hurt, people being maimed, and all sorts of things of that nature, right? So you do have your kind of minor criminal enterprises, right? So pickpockets, swindlers, thieves, they're kind of thriving in these cramped urban living conditions. The murder rate from 1880 to 1900 went from 25 million to over 25 per million to over 100 per million. So it kind of skyrockets times 4. Alcoholism is largely attributed to being a factor in a lot of these crimes, right? A lot of the men who went out of their way to hurt people during this time were alcoholics or drank a lot. And so that's going to be a common thing that a lot of reformers seize on and say, hey, maybe we need to ban alcohol. And so that's going to take a few decades for that to really catch up. But eventually in the 1920s, a lot of years and people of talking about that finally culminates in that, right? So alcoholism is going to be bad. I'm not sure what this guy committed a crime in. Looks like his biggest crime was his hairdo, but nonetheless, he was kind of a typical criminal this time. Also, beyond just crime, disease and pollution are pretty outright rank and pretty outright disgusting in a lot of these communities, right? So that's even worse of an issue, ultimately, even than crime. Improper sewage disposal contaminates much of the city's drinking water, which, of course, is triggering lots of epidemics of typhoid fever and cholera at this particular moment. Horse manure is outright thrown in the streets. Soot and ash are accumulating from coal and wood fires. So the cleaning, the drinking water and the water used for all sorts of stuff is really contaminated, which again makes this disgusting conditions in these cities, right? So we're already seeing a lot of things, hopefully, between crime, between poverty, between diseases and pollution, that a lot of reformers are going to start to seize on. A lot of those kind of social gospel folks in the cities are really going to say, hey, we need to start tackling these problems and making life better for the middle class and even especially the working class, okay? Politics is also a bit of an unfortunate game happening during this time. Political machines, especially, are taking off and really ruining people's chances for participating in democracy equally and fairly. And what political machines are, kind of the textbook definition, are informal political groups designed to keep and maintain power for a prolonged period of time, right? So these are coming about partly because cities had grown too fast for the governments to keep up, right? That the cities are growing so large and the cities are really overmatched and running out of hand. And so a lot of people are going to start cutting corners in city government to try to manage communities that are growing all the more unmanageable. Okay, so that's providing new arrival jobs, housing, food, police protection, all in exchange for votes, right? So especially all these immigrants who are coming in, or Americans from elsewhere are coming into these cities. Basically, these city managers are saying, oh, yeah, well, legislatures and aldermen and all these people are saying, oh, yeah, we'll take care of all your problems, but you got to make sure you vote for us. Otherwise, we're not doing anything, right? And that's the opposite of how politics should work, right? Politicians should provide for you goods and services beforehand to show, hey, this is why I'm valid or I should be in your corner when it comes to, representing you in government, right? So it's almost a jury rigging it in the opposite direction and saying, no, you have to vote for us, and then we'll give you the good stuff. And as you can imagine, the good stuff hardly ever came after these people voted for these corrupt and criminal individuals. And so party bosses are the ones who ran these political machines, and they're the ones who really had all the control over the city's finances themselves. Okay, so many are going to get rich quick through graft, another name for getting money through dishonest or corrupt means, basically bribing individuals, right? That's how a lot of these party bosses are going to operate, where they're mostly only helping the upper class folks who want to make sure things are going in their favor. And certainly middle class or lower class folks don't have those same economic advantages. And so their influence is just going to go by the wayside, right? That's how politics still works, and how it often works is the rich just keep getting richer, right? And so a lot of these party bosses are accepting bribes from contractors to compete unfairly for street, sewer, and business contracts, right? So that's going to be a huge thing. Tammany Hall especially is going to be kind of the textbook definition for a lot of these corrupt business practices. And Tammany Hall was in New York City. It was a democratically ran machine. Now, there were Republican political machines as well, but in particular, the Democrat politically ran machines were oftentimes worse. And Tammany Hall is going to be the most infamous and known all across the country. And a guy by the name of William Boss Tweed was, as everybody called him, was the guy who really ran this kind of political machine in the 1870s. He runs it, and he's actually going to be jailed in 1874 due to people finding out and catching him for some of the stuff he was doing, right? So Tammany Hall in New York City was especially bad. Boss Tweed was the lead there. And in general, again, this is not a politics that is equitable for the people, right? And this went across, racial bounds, right? a lot of working class white people were not being represented. Certainly, working class African Americans or these immigrant folks are not being well represented. And so this is not purely a racial problem, especially in these cities. It's really just a class problem, right? That if you were born in a certain class, then it's automatically held against you or for you, depending on where you're at. And so a lot of people are not getting the help that they need to succeed, or not even succeed greatly, but even barely make a living or compete in this urban environments. Okay. So again, immigrants played a huge role in these transitions. Okay. So European immigrants, especially, are going to flood the East Coast of the United States. And in between 1865 and 1914, over that roughly 50-year span, which is roughly speaking probably the most transformational moment in America's history is this 50 years, nearly 25 million Europeans immigrate, come to the United States. Okay. Now, more than half of these immigrants are from Eastern or Southern Europe, and they get the name of new immigrants. So these are immigrants from Italy, Greece, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Serbia. A common trait among many of these immigrants, not all, but many, is that they're Catholic or they're not readily Protestant in the same way that old immigrants had been, right? Where those from Northern and Western Europe, they're going to be a lot more Protestant by nature. And we've talked long about how America is kind of pretty anti-Catholic during a lot of this period of the 19th century. So a lot of these Eastern and Southern Europeans, again, Italians, Greeks, Austria-Hungarians, Russians, and Serbians who are coming over are going to be heavily discriminated against because they just don't easily fit into American society in quite the same way. Why are a lot of these people coming over in the first place? Well, one, they had a lot of issues in poverty and class from the nations that they were coming from and were heard about the United States, said this might be a great place to start over. And in general, the United States certainly offered a lot of stability and plenty of jobs for these immigrants coming over, okay? So certainly the Atlantic voyage coming over to the East Coast was oftentimes very difficult. And the passage was often booked in steerage, which was basically the cheapest accommodations possible for some of these steamships. So as they're coming over, sometimes they're catching diseases or sometimes they're in very tight or cramped positions. But many of them are saying that whatever I have to do to get to the United States, it doesn't matter. I need to get over there as quickly as possible, right? So a lot of these passengers disembark from Ellis Island, which is in New York Harbor. And Ellis Island, hopefully we'll talk a little bit out in class, was this 3-story building that was really served as the main processing center for many European immigrants arriving after 1892, right? So many of the European immigrants who came to the United States are going to pass through Ellis Island, right? And now, if you're in class, I'll show you a clip of what that looked like from the film The Godfather Part 2, which is a masterpiece film. And that'll give you an idea of kind of what that looked like. And again, it was a huge endeavor to get all these people cleared. And oftentimes by the end of the day, once you arrive, you could step out and now enjoy your path eventually to citizenship and your ability or your chance to make the American dream possible for you and your family, right? So typically the immigration processing centers, Ellis Island, as I said, took about a day. And as these immigrants are coming through, the medical examiners are stopping them, checking them, looking at their eyes, looking at their teeth, looking at their bodies and saying, you maybe need to be quarantined. That's certainly a word we're very familiar with right now, right? If you had some sort of a disease that came from Europe and they didn't want to necessarily, send them out into the American population. So oftentimes some of these people are going to be quarantined for a period of time. Oftentimes also families are sometimes separated as a result of this, not by force saying, you'll never meet them again in the same ways that we did that with slaves, but families are going to be separated, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, sadly, and some are going to be sent back to Europe if they have a disease or an issue that's particularly preventing them from coming in. Okay, so the nation's East Coast, the large cities in the more eastern part of the country, New York City, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, they're going to start to balloon as a result, right? They're already relatively big cities, but now all these immigrants are coming in, they're going to get larger and larger and larger. And many of these immigrants are going to start separating themselves quite naturally into ethnic neighborhoods, meaning that, the Italians, they kind of have their area, the Little Italy, the Greeks have Greek town, Germans have Germantown, that they're mostly focusing and staying in their particular ethnic neighborhoods. And that allows for a variety of things. One, it allows them a cushion, right? That they're staying in their own areas, they're speaking their native languages. And as a result, They're recreating old customs that were true of Europe here in America. So they're recreating their churches or synagogues. They're forming social clubs and newspapers that are maybe in their native languages or subscribe to their native customs. So that's a good transition point for a lot of these people, new Americans who are saying, okay, I'm both an American or on the path to citizenship, but also I'm from this other culture. It allows them to practice both, right? That they can practice that culture that they come from while also practicing, this kind of new American culture, right? So oftentimes the immigrants who best succeeded, as you can imagine, are the ones whose English is the best. So teaching a lot of these recent immigrants English is very important, especially the younger children who are coming over, to teach them English as quickly as possible. That was very important so they would have a path towards being a lot more successful than maybe their parents and their adults in their lives who learning English took a lot longer just because English is a complex language. And the older you get, the harder it is to learn, right? So also, particularly for these young immigrant children, developing youths and young adults, developing marketing skills to help manage their money was also incredibly important, right? Because we wanted to create, put them on the path to success as much as possible. Now, last slide here. As you can imagine, though, as more and more immigrants are coming over, nativism rears its ugly head yet again, right? And in particular, in the East, the Irish were a very common target, okay, because many of these Irish are arriving here poor. Many of them can't read or write. Many of them are finding the lowest possible jobs, right? So miners, ditch diggers, factory workers, right? Jobs that didn't require a lot of education but were hard manual labor. Oftentimes, the Irish, unfortunately, found themselves in positions where they couldn't take anything else. That's just what they had to go with, right? And again, as I said, America is a largely anti-Catholic nation at this particular moment in time. And so very much Protestant fueled. So anything that's Protestant or British influence, they're a fan of. But the Irish had long problems with the British, and so they're going to be looked at badly. And a lot of these other ones, right? A lot of these other new immigrant nations or immigrant peoples that don't nicely fit into a Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, American / British way of doing things, they're not going to be as big of a fan of, right? So they're going to say, oh, these people are lazy, these people are superstitious, these people are ignorant, which certainly there were people in any group that were. However, there's a lot that are saying, hey, I'll do whatever it takes to become an American, who are working hard, who are doing everything they can do, and some of them are still being discriminated against. In 1882, there's a federal law that's going to be instituted that bans convicts, paupers, and the mentally disabled from immigrating to the United States. So that's as a way to try to say we only want the best and the brightest. Of course, some are still going to make their way over anyways. And also they place 50-cent head tax on each newcomer, right? So a lot of people who come didn't even know that, oh, now you got to pay this 50-cent head tax. And so 50 cents sounds pretty low, but some who are coming over incredibly poor don't even have that to spare, right? So some are going to be turned away as a result of that. Now, if I had more time, I'd spend more time talking about all the Asian immigrants who are coming on the West Coast. So mostly European immigrants on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, you're starting to see a lot of Asian immigrants come over, in particular the Chinese, as we talked about or seen in the class in the past. A lot of Chinese immigrants are coming over. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment is happening on the West Coast, sometimes leading to outright racial violence. And so Dennis Kearney, who himself was an Irish immigrant, organized a working man's party in California in the 1870s to fight Chinese immigration. So that really speaks to, I'll end it here, some of the racism of this time, that even some Irish who would be discriminated against on the East, some of them are moving further west and say, well, it's easier for us to unite us fellow white people against this common enemy that is Asian immigrants or Chinese immigrants, to kind of make themselves feel better about themselves feeling like outsiders, then organize groups to fight these Chinese immigrants, which again is just garden variety of racism. But nonetheless, both Chinese and Irish immigrants are going to be incredibly crucial when it comes to building the transcontinental railroad. So both played a very crucial role during this period of American history. So that's going to do it for today. This is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Take care.